Emily Grace Thompson adjusted the simple pearl necklace her grandmother had given her before heading out for another day of teaching at Asheville Elementary School in Asheville, North Carolina. At 42, she had dedicated 2 decades to elementary education, finding genuine joy in the smiles and discoveries of her third-grade students. The sky that September morning was a deep blue, typical of the early days of spring in the region. The mountains surrounding the town seemed more imposing than usual, and the air carried the familiar aroma of roasted coffee from local cafes. Emily took a deep breath, savoring that moment of peace before getting into her car, a 2015 Toyota Corolla that, despite its age, still served her faithfully. "Our Father, who art in heaven," she murmured her morning prayer as she drove. It was a habit inherited from her mother, Mrs. Elizabeth, who always said that no day should begin without a conversation with God. Emily smiled as she remembered her mother, who had been resting with the Lord for 5 years now after a battle with cancer, that, though painful, never shook her unwavering faith. At school, her students greeted her with their usual enthusiasm. Liam, a boy with bright eyes and a mischievous smile, ran to hug her as soon as she entered the classroom. "Teacher, did you bring that book you promised?" "Of course, Liam. It's right here in my bag." She took out a copy of The Little Prince and handed it to the boy, who hugged it as if it were a treasure. Emily Grace Thompson had the habit of lending books to students who showed an interest in reading, believing that every page turned was a window opening to new horizons. During the Portuguese class, while explaining the use of adjectives, she felt a slight twinge in her chest. She ignored it, attributing it to the natural fatigue at the end of the term. She continued her explanation, writing on the board in her neat handwriting, "The blue September sky embraced the mountainous city." "Who can identify the adjectives in this sentence?" she asked, turning to the class. Several little hands eagerly shot up. During the break in the teacher's lounge, her colleague Olivia noticed that she looked paler than usual. "Emily, are you okay? You seem tired." "I'm fine, Liv. I just need to rest a bit over the weekend," she replied, trying to mask the growing discomfort in her chest. In the afternoon, during the last class, the pain intensified. Her vision began to blur slightly, and the air seemed heavier to breathe into her lungs. Even so, she continued. Her students were presenting projects on Brazilian folklore, and she didn't want to interrupt that special moment. Sophia, a shy student with colorful braids, was presenting about the mermaid when Emily Grace Thompson felt a strong dizziness. She leaned on the desk, taking deep breaths. The chalk slipped from her fingers, breaking on the floor with a crack that seemed to echo in the now silent classroom. "Teacher?" Sophia's worried voice seemed to come from far away. Emily Grace tried to smile to reassure the students, but the pain in her chest had turned into unbearable pressure. Her legs gave way, and she slowly slid to the floor as frightened voices called her name. "Help! The teacher is sick!" Liam's shout echoed through the hallway as Emily Grace struggled to stay conscious. In her last moments of lucidity, she thought of her grandmother, who always said that prayer was the breath of the soul. She tried to pray, but the words were lost in her increasingly foggy mind. The frightened faces of her students were the last thing she saw before everything went dark. The sound of the ambulance siren was muffled by the murmur of worried voices. Olivia held her hand, praying softly, while the paramedics worked quickly. In the school hallway, a spontaneous prayer chain formed, with teachers and students united, in a moment of desperate faith. No one knew, but that wasn't just the end of an ordinary day at Asheville Elementary School. It was the beginning of a journey that would transcend the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, an experience that would forever change the life of Emily Grace Thompson and everyone around her. The last thing that crossed her mind, before everything faded completely, was the face of her mother and her gentle voice saying, "My dear, always remember that God has a purpose for every moment of our lives, even those we don't understand." Emily's first moment of awareness was marked by an indescribable feeling of lightness. The pain that had once gripped her chest had completely disappeared, replaced by a profound peace she had never experienced before. She opened her eyes slowly, expecting to find the fluorescent lights of a hospital room, but what she saw left her speechless. She was enveloped in a soft, welcoming light that had no specific source but seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The environment around her was hard to define. There were no visible walls or ceiling, just an infinite space filled with shades of blue and gold that blended like a celestial watercolor. Where am I? Her voice sounded different, as if reverberating through multiple dimensions. It was then that she realized she could see her own body lying on a stretcher in the emergency room of Asheville General Hospital. The scene unfolded below her as if she were watching a movie in which she was the protagonist. A medical team worked frantically, performing resuscitation procedures. The heart monitor showed a flatline and the monotonous sound of the machine seemed distant. "Do not be afraid, Emily Grace." A soft and comforting voice sounded beside her. As she turned, she encountered a luminous presence that, though lacking a defined form, conveyed an inexplicable familiarity. "You are at the threshold between two worlds," the presence continued. "This is a special moment that has been prepared for you since before your birth." Emily Grace watched, fascinated, as memories of her life began to materialize around her like floating soap bubbles. In each one, she could see moments of prayer, herself as a child, kneeling by the bed with her mother, as a teenager, seeking guidance before exams, as an adult praying for her students before each class. "Every prayer of yours has been heard," said the presence. "Every word, every sigh, every thought directed toward heaven has been recorded. Come, there is much I need to show you." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Olivia arrived breathless, having followed the ambulance in her own car. She found the waiting room already occupied by other teachers from the school and some parents of students who had been alerted about the incident. Everyone awaited news in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sound of whispered prayers. Back in the spiritual realm, Emily Grace Thompson was led through a corridor of light. As they advanced, she began to hear voices, thousands of them, in a harmonious choir blending prayers in different languages. "These are the prayers being offered at this very moment," her guide explained. "Each one is like a note in a celestial symphony, a unique expression of faith and love that transcends time and space." Emily Grace watched in awe as each prayer manifested as a beam of colored light, forming a complex and beautiful web that stretched infinitely. "But how is this possible?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "How are all these prayers heard at the same time?" "Divine love knows no bounds of time or space," replied the presence. "Each prayer is unique and precious. Each one receives full and individual attention, even when millions are uttered simultaneously." At that moment, Emily Grace Thompson began to understand the true magnitude of the power of prayer. It wasn't just a ritual or a habit. It was a real force that connected the visible to the invisible, the temporal to the eternal. At the hospital, the doctors continued their efforts to revive her. "It's been 20 minutes, murmured one of them, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Once more," he ordered, preparing for another attempt at resuscitation. Olivia, outside, organized a prayer. Chain with those present. "Lord," she whispered, "please don't take our Emily Grace yet. She has so much to do, so many lives to touch." In the spiritual realm, Emily Grace felt a deep connection with each of those prayers. She could see how every word spoken in faith generated waves of energy that rippled through the spiritual universe, affecting realities that human eyes could not perceive. "Now," said her guide, "I will show you something that will forever change your understanding of the power of prayer. Prepare yourself, Emily Grace, for what you are about to see will reveal the true purpose of your earthly journey." The environment around Emily Grace Thompson suddenly transformed. The web of lights from prayers gave way to an expansive panorama that seemed to encompass her entire life, but from a completely new perspective. It was as if she could simultaneously see the physical and spiritual planes, actions and their consequences, the visible and the invisible. "Observe," said her guide, directing her attention to a specific scene. It was an ordinary morning 3 years ago. Emily Grace saw herself quickly praying before leaving for school, a habit she sometimes performed almost mechanically. However, what was happening on the spiritual plane was extraordinary. Her simple words of prayer generated waves of light that expanded like ripples in water, creating an invisible protective barrier. "That day," explained the guide, "your prayer prevented a serious accident. One of your students, Ethan, was about to cross the street absent-mindedly when a car was speeding toward him. The protection generated by your prayer caused him to trip and fall onto the sidewalk, avoiding a tragedy." Emily Grace watched, moved as the scene unfolded. She vaguely remembered Ethan arriving late that day with a small scrape on his knee, but she had never imagined the true extent of what had happened. "Every prayer of yours, even the briefest, has power," continued the guide. "But there is more. I need to show you." The scene changed again, and Emily Grace found herself in her classroom, silently praying for a student who seemed particularly sad that day. On the spiritual plane, her prayer manifested as a hug of light enveloping the girl. "Hemas," said the guide. That day she had decided to give up on everything. The situation at home was unbearable, and she no longer saw any point in continuing. Your prayer, combined with your attentive gaze and words of encouragement, changed the course of her life. Tears streamed down Emily Grace's face as she saw Emma, now a teenager, helping other children overcome difficult moments. At the hospital, time continued to pass. The doctors, after almost giving up, decided to make one last attempt at resuscitation. Olivia and the others continued in fervent prayer in the waiting room, now joined by more people who arrived upon hearing the news. Back on the spiritual plane, her guide led her through more revelations. Emily Grace saw how her daily prayers for the school created a protective spiritual field that affected not only the students, but their entire families. She observed invisible battles being won through simple words of faith, spoken in the most ordinary moments. "But there is something more you need to understand," said the guide, his voice taking on a graver tone. "There are forces that constantly work to weaken the power of prayer." The scene shifted to show how seemingly harmless distractions, the phone ringing during moments of prayer, the rush of daily life, the fatigue used as an excuse, were actually subtle strategies to diminish the effectiveness of prayers. "Notice how the enemy works in the small things," the guide explained. "He knows he cannot completely stop your prayers, so he tries to make them superficial, mechanical, devoid of true connection." Emily Grace Thompson saw moments when she had given into these distractions and how it affected the power of her prayers. However, she also saw how, even on the busiest days, when she managed to maintain focus and sincerity in her prayers, the impact was immense. "Now I want to show you something very special," said the guide, leading her through a new portal of light. "The legacy of prayers from your family." Before her, a majestic tree materialized, its branches glowing with thousands of small lights, each representing a prayer made by generations of her family. "See," said the guide, "these older lights are the prayers of your great-grandmother, Mary of Sorrows. Even though she was illiterate, her simple and sincere prayers built a powerful spiritual legacy." Emily Grace watched, moved, as the prayers of her great-grandmother connected to those of her grandmother, Helen, forming intricate patterns of light that stretched across generations. She saw her mother, Elizabeth, kneeling by the bed every night praying for her and her siblings. "Every prayer they made remains active, bearing fruit even today," the guide explained. When her grandmother prayed for her future grandchildren, even without knowing them, she was establishing protection and blessings that her own children are experiencing today. At the hospital, the heart monitor began to show a faint sign of activity. The doctors, who were about to declare the time of death, intensified their efforts with renewed hope. "Emily Grace," called the guide, his voice now more urgent, "there is one last thing I need to show you before you return. Something that will completely change your understanding of the purpose of your life." The scene around Emily Grace transformed once again. Now she found herself before an immense three-dimensional panel that seemed to contain all the lives she had touched through her prayers and actions. It was an intricate web of connections, some obvious, others surprising. "Every person you influenced," explained the guide, "became a channel of blessings for others. It is a multiplier effect that transcends generations." Emily Grace watched in awe as a simple prayer made by a student years ago had triggered a series of events that resulted in the transformation of entire families. She saw how small acts of kindness, driven by prayer, created waves of change that spread exponentially. "But there is something deeper," the guide continued. "You were chosen for a specific purpose in this generation." The panel expanded, revealing a larger pattern. Emily Grace saw how her position as a teacher was no coincidence. She was strategically placed to influence lives at a crucial stage of formation. "Among your current students," the guide revealed, "are future leaders, teachers, doctors, and individuals who will have a significant impact on their community. Your prayers and example are planting seeds that will blossom in the decades to come." At the hospital, Emily Grace's vital signs were gradually stabilizing. In the waiting room, Olivia felt an inexplicable sense of peace amidst her anxiety. However, the guide's voice grew more serious. "With great purpose comes great responsibility. What you are seeing now is only a fraction of the potential your prayers can achieve if carried out with full awareness and dedication." Emily Grace saw alternate versions of the future, one where her prayers became deeper and more frequent, resulting in even more significant transformations, and another where distractions and routine gradually drained the power of her prayers. "The choice will always be yours," said the guide, "but now you know what is at stake." The light around Emily Grace began to shift subtly. The ethereal environment surrounding her took on a different quality, as if preparing for a transition. "The time to return is approaching," the guide announced, "but first I need to show you one last thing." Before her, a scene from the present materialized, the hospital waiting room, where dozens of people, teachers, parents, students, and even strangers, were united in prayer. Emily Grace Thompson could see how each prayer formed a pillar of light that extended into the spiritual plane. "Do you see how love and faith can unite people?" asked the guide. "Each of these prayers is contributing to your return. It is a testament to the impact you've had on their lives." In the ICU, the doctors watched in awe as Emily Grace's vital signs gradually strengthened. Dr. Michael, with 30 years of experience, had never seen such an extraordinary recovery after such a long cardiac arrest. "It's a miracle," he murmured to the head nurse, Mrs. Margaret, who silently made the sign of the cross. On the spiritual plane, Emily Grace felt a gentle pressure, as if she were being pulled back into her body. "Remember," said the guide, his voice now blending with others that Emily Grace recognized, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, "you are returning with a renewed purpose. Every prayer matters. Every moment is an opportunity to create waves of transformation in the spiritual realm." The sensation of return intensified. Emily Grace Thompson began to feel her physical body again. First, a distant tingling, then the gradual awareness of each limb. The sounds of the hospital, once muffled, became clearer. The beeping of monitors, the whispers of the medical team, the soft hum of the air conditioning. "Do not forget," were the guide's last words. "You are never alone in your mission." The spiritual realm is always present, always active, always responding to every sincere prayer. The return to physical consciousness was gradual. First, Emily noticed the distinct smell of the hospital, a mix of disinfectant and medication. Then she began to recognize familiar voices around her. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the fluorescent light of the ICU room. "She's waking up," exclaimed a voice she recognized as Mrs. Margaret's. Dr. Michael immediately approached the bed, checking her vital signs with an expression of astonishment and joy on his face. "Mrs. Emily Grace, can you hear me?" She tried to respond, but her throat was dry from the intubation. She could only nod slightly. A tear rolled down her face as she realized she was truly back. In the hallway, the news spread quickly. Olivia, who hadn't left the hospital since the incident, fell to her knees in gratitude. The other teachers and friends in the waiting room embraced, crying and laughing at the same time. Emily Grace watched everything with a new perspective. Each person around her now represented not just an individual, but a complete web of possibilities and spiritual connections. She could feel, even if more subtly than in the spiritual plane, the prayers still flowing toward her. In the days that followed, her recovery amazed all the doctors. There were no neurological after effects, something practically impossible considering the time she had gone without brain oxygenation. The tests showed no damage to her heart or lungs. It was as if her body had been completely restored. 1 week after her return, Emily Grace Thompson was sitting on the porch of her house watching the sunset paint the sky of Asheville with shades of orange and pink. The fresh mountain air carried the scent of hydrangeas her Aunt Celeste had brought, mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that Olivia had prepared during her visit. "I still can't believe it," said Olivia, sitting down beside her friend, with 2 steaming cups. "The doctors say it's a miracle. 32 minutes, Emily. You were dead for 32 minutes. Emily Grace held the cup between her hands, feeling its comforting warmth. Every small moment like this now carried a deeper meaning. "Liv, I need to tell you something, but I want you to keep an open mind." Over the next 2 hours, Emily Grace shared her experience. She spoke about the light, the guide, the revelations, about the power of prayer. She described how she saw the impact of every prayer on the spiritual plane and how she understood the true meaning of her calling as a teacher. Olivia listened intently, silent tears streaming down her face. "You know," she finally said, "during those hours at the hospital I felt something different. It was as if we could almost touch the sky with our prayers." The phone rang inside the house. It was Liam, her student, calling for the 3rd time that week to ask when she would return to school. The concern and affection from her students moved her deeply. "Tell him I'll be back soon," she replied to her sister Beatrice, who had answered the phone. "And Bea, can you help me with something tomorrow? I want to reorganize my prayer routine." The next morning, Emily Grace woke up before sunrise. She sat in her prayer corner, a simple space with a Bible, a rosary inherited from her grandmother, and a few family photos. But now that space held a completely new meaning. She closed her eyes and began to pray. Unlike before, each word was spoken with a deep awareness of its power. In her mind, she could almost see waves of light expanding, touching lives she didn't even know. "Lord," she whispered, "help me to be a more conscious instrument of your love." During breakfast, Beatrice watched her sister with curiosity. There was something different about her, a deep peace, a more intense presence. "You seem different, sis," commented Bea, spreading butter on the homemade bread the neighbor had brought. "It's not just the physical recovery. It's something more." Emily Grace smiled, thinking about how to explain. "Bea, remember how Mom always said that every prayer is like a seed planted in heaven? Yes, she used to say that all the time. Now I completely understand what she meant. Every word of prayer truly plants something that grows, that multiplies, that touches other lives in ways we can't even imagine." That afternoon, Emily Grace received a visit from Dr. Michael, who had come to check on her recovery. He was still intrigued by the case. "Mrs. Emily Grace," he said, putting away the stethoscope, "in 30 years of medicine, I have never seen anything like it. Your recovery defies all medical explanations." "Doctor," she replied with a serene smile, "sometimes the greatest miracles happen precisely to remind us that there is much more between heaven and earth than our science can explain." The doctor fell silent for a moment, deep in thought. "You know," he finally said, "since your case, I've found myself praying more. Not just for my patients, but for everything. It's as if something has awakened in me." Emily Grace nodded, understanding deeply. That was exactly what her experience was meant to provoke, an awakening to the spiritual dimension that had always been present, but that many had forgotten or ignored. 2 weeks after her hospital discharge, Emily Grace was ready to return to Asheville Elementary School. The day dawned with a fine drizzle typical of North Carolina winters, but even the overcast sky couldn't diminish the special glow of that morning. She dressed with extra care, choosing her favorite navy blue dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace. Before leaving, she knelt in her prayer corner. "Lord," she prayed softly, "may I be a channel of your love for every child you have placed under my care." Upon arriving at the school, she was greeted by an explosion of joy. The courtyard was decorated with welcome posters, and her students ran to hug her as soon as she stepped out of the car. "Teacher!" shouted Liam, his eyes shining with emotion. "You don't know how much we prayed. Every night before bed, just like you taught us." Sophia, still shy but with a radiant smile, handed her a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked on the way to school. "They're daisies, teacher. Mom said they mean renewal." Principal Marcia, who always maintained a more reserved demeanor, couldn't hold back her tears as she hugged her. "Welcome back, Emily Grace. This school wasn't the same without you." As she entered her classroom, Emily Grace felt a different kind of emotion. Now she could perceive, even if subtly, the spiritual dimension of that space. Each desk did not merely represent a physical place, but a meeting point between the visible and the invisible, where lives were shaped and destinies were influenced. "Before we begin our lesson," she said after everyone had settled, "I want to share something with you." The children listened attentively as she told a simplified version of her experience, emphasizing how each of their prayers had been important for her return. "You know," she continued, "when we pray, it's like we light a little light in the sky. And when many people pray together, those lights come together and form something so strong that true miracles can happen." During the break, in the teachers' lounge, her colleagues noticed a significant change in her presence. There was a special serenity in her gaze, a depth in her words that hadn't been there before. "You should have seen," commented Mrs. Zulida, the most senior teacher at the school, "how the children came together in prayer for you. Even those who had never shown any interest in anything spiritual were involved." Olivia, who watched her, friend with affection, noticed how each of Emily Grace Thompson's words now seemed to carry a different weight, as if they were small seeds being planted in the hearts of those who heard them. In the afternoon, during the Portuguese class, something special happened. While explaining the importance of words, Emily Grace Thompson saw, for a brief moment, that same light she had experienced during her near-death experience. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, dancing among the students like a silent reminder of the spiritual dimension that permeates everything. "Teacher," called Emma, the same student who years before had been touched by her prayers without knowing, "you seem different." "It's like there's a light inside you," said the girl. Emily Grace smiled, touched by the child's sensitivity. "You know, Emma, we all have that light within us. Sometimes we just need something special to make us realize it." The impact of Emily Grace's return to school spread quickly through the small town of Asheville. Her story of near-death and miraculous recovery began to circulate first among the families of the students, then through the local church community, and soon it seemed like the entire town was talking about the miracle of the teacher who came back to life. One Saturday afternoon, while having her coffee at Heavenly Taste Bakery near the school, she was approached by Mrs. Carmina, a woman she didn't even know. "You're the teacher Emily Grace, aren't you? The one who—" The woman hesitated, searching for the right words. "Yes, that's me," Emily Grace replied with a warm smile. "My granddaughter attends your school in the other class. Ever since you came back, she started doing something she never did before, praying. She says she wants to have a light like yours." Emily Grace Thompson felt her heart warm at those words. It was exactly what her spiritual guide had shown her, how every action, every word, every gesture of faith could create waves of transformation that spread in unexpected ways. The following Sunday, Father Joseph invited her to share her testimony during the Mass. Our Lady of Health Cathedral was more crowded than usual, with people even standing in the aisles. "When I crossed the veil between this world and the next," she began, her voice soft but steady, echoing through the speakers, "I discovered that our prayers are far more powerful than we imagine. Every word spoken with true faith creates ripples in the spiritual world that affect our reality in ways we cannot see, but that are absolutely real." Among the crowd was Dr. Michael, the physician who had treated her at the hospital. Beside him, his wife Sandra held his hand tightly, silent tears streaming down her face as she listened to the account. After the Mass, several people approached to talk. Among them was Lillian, the mother of one of her students, who confided, in a low voice, "Teacher, ever since my son Ethan told me about your experience, I've started looking at life differently. You know those prayers we say out of habit without much thought. Now every time I pray, I remember what you said about the lights in the sky." The following Monday, something unusual happened at school. During recess, Emily Grace Thompson, found a group of students sitting in a circle in the courtyard with their eyes closed. "What are you all doing?" she asked curiously. "We're praying, teacher," replied Sophia. "We started a little prayer group. Every day we pray for something different. Today it's for our parents." Olivia, who was passing through the courtyard at that moment, stopped to observe the scene. "This is happening in other classes too," she commented. "It's like a wave of spirituality is sweeping through the school." That evening at home, Emily Grace reflected on all these events while organizing her lesson plans. Her notebook was open to the same page where, weeks earlier, she had written her last note before the incident. Now, her lessons weren't just about Portuguese or math. They were opportunities to sow light and hope. Her phone rang. It was Principal Marcia. "Emily Grace," the principal's voice sounded emotional. "Could you come to school earlier tomorrow? There's something I need to show you." The next morning, Emily Grace arrived at school just as the sun was rising. She found Marcia in her office, along with Olivia and Mrs. Zulaida. On the table, there was a yellowed envelope. "This was stored in the school's old archives," explained Marcia, her hands trembling slightly as she held the envelope. "We found it yesterday during a cleanup. I think you need to see this." Inside the envelope was a black and white photograph, dated 1953. It showed a group of teachers in front of the school building, which at the time was still called Ashville Elementary School. In the center of the photo, a young teacher smiled serenely at the camera. "This," said Mrs. Zulaidi, pointing to the young teacher, "was your grandmother Helen." Emily Grace felt her heart race. Her grandmother had never mentioned that she had been a teacher at the same school. Along with the photo, there was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly faded by time. "Dear Diary," the letter began, "Today I had an extraordinary experience during my morning prayer. I found myself enveloped in an inexplicable light, and a divine presence showed me something marvelous. I saw future generations being touched through the prayers made in this school. I saw my future granddaughter, who has not yet been born, continuing this legacy of faith and love." Tears streamed freely down Emily Grace Thompson's face as she read. Her grandmother had had a vision of her, decades before her birth. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Her calling to be a teacher, her placement in that specific school, her own near-death experience. "There's more," said Marcia, pulling another document from the envelope. It was a list of names, students who had passed through her grandmother's class. Among them, Emily recognized the surnames of several of her own current students. "It's like a circle closing," murmured Olivia, "your prayers connecting with hers through the generations." At that moment, Emily once again experienced that familiar feeling of transcendence. For a brief instant, she could see again that luminous web of prayers her spiritual guide had shown her. But now she understood that she was part of something much greater, a divine plan that stretched across generations. "Grandma Helen always said that prayers are seeds planted in heaven," said Emily Grace Thompson, her voice choked with emotion. "Now I understand that she wasn't just repeating a saying, she had truly seen it." As they talked, the first students began arriving at the school. Through the office window, Emily Grace watched as the courtyard gradually filled with life and movement. Each child who passed carried not only their backpacks and notebooks, but also the potential to be part of that spiritual current that transcended time. "You know," said Mrs. Zulaid, "since you came back, I've noticed something different in the school. It's as if an ancient light had been rekindled," Olivia finished. That night, Emily Grace couldn't sleep. Sitting on her porch, she watched the lights of Ashville twinkling in the darkness as her heart overflowed with emotions. The discovery about her grandmother had given new meaning to everything she had experienced. She picked up the old family album and began flipping through its yellowed pages. Each photograph now seemed to tell a deeper story. There was one in particular that had always caught her attention: her grandmother Helen, her mother Elizabeth as a child, and herself as a baby. 3 generations united in a moment captured by time. "Now I understand, Grandma," she whispered to the photograph. "You always knew." The next morning, upon arriving at school, Emily Grace gathered her students in a circle. It was time to share something special with them. "Children," she began, "do you remember when I talked about how our prayers are like lights in the sky? Today, I want to tell you a story about how those lights can shine through time." With simple words, she told them about her grandmother, Helen, and how she had been a teacher at the same school decades ago. She spoke about the letter she had found and how prayers can build bridges between generations. "Do you see these walls?" she said, gently touching the classroom wall. "They hold thousands of prayers from teachers, from students, from parents. Each prayer is like a tiny seed that keeps growing, even after the person who planted it has passed." "On?" Liam raised his hand, his eyes shining with curiosity. "Teacher, does that mean when we pray it's not just for now?" "Exactly, Liam. Every sincere prayer has a power that goes beyond the present moment. It can touch lives that haven't even been born yet." In the weeks that followed, the school witnessed a quiet but profound transformation. The students' prayer group grew, now involving children from all grades. The teachers began to notice subtle changes in the students' behavior, more compassion, more cooperation, and a greater awareness of the impact of their actions on others. On a particularly meaningful afternoon, Emily Grace organized an intergenerational gathering at the school. Parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents of students were invited to share their stories and memories. The schoolyard filled with voices weaving a tapestry of shared experiences. Mrs. Zulaida, moved, shared her own memories of when she was a student at the school. "You know," she said, "I always felt there was something special about this place. Now I understand that it's a meeting point between heaven and earth, where prayers from different times come together and grow stronger." Emily Grace watched it all with a serene smile. Her spiritual guide had shown her the power of prayers in the invisible realm, but now she could see their effects manifesting in the visible world, day after day. At night, in her little prayer corner, Emily Grace Thompson offered a special prayer of gratitude. As she prayed, she once again felt that familiar presence, her spiritual guide who had accompanied her on her journey between worlds. "You have understood," said the gentle voice in her heart. "Each prayer is part of an eternal symphony, each life a unique instrument in this divine orchestra." Emily smiled, feeling complete. Her near-death experience had not been solely about her own transformation. It was part of a greater plan, a call to awaken others to the spiritual reality that permeates all things. On her nightstand, the old photo of her grandmother Helen seemed to smile in approval. The legacy of prayers would continue, passed down from generation to generation, weaving an invisible web of light and love that transcends time and space. "The journey continues," thought Emily, gazing out the window at the starry sky of Asheville. "Each prayer is a new beginning, each day a new opportunity to be a channel of light." And so, in the small town of North Carolina, Emily's story became more than just a tale of a near-death experience. It became a living testament to the transformative power of faith and prayer, a reminder that every word directed to heaven echoes in eternity, touching lives in ways only the heart can truly understand.